There is a particular kind of quiet that a two-bedroom apartment has when the person who used to fill your house with noise has taken the children, the furniture, and the framed photographs off the walls, leaving you with nothing but a legal lease and a forwarding address. It is a sterile, Echo Valley sort of quiet. It does not merely exist. It actively presses against your eardrums, reminding you of the exact dimensions of everything you managed to lose when you weren't looking. I had been living in that specific, low-frequency silence for exactly 2 years on the second-floor apartment on Spring Street in Charleston, South Carolina, when my body finally decided it had absorbed quite enough of it. It was March 17th, 2025, a Monday morning that carried the first deceptive warmth of a coastal Carolina spring. I was doing precisely what I had done almost every morning for 2 decades. Walking the historic, oak-canopied streets of the Cannonboro neighborhood, watching the Holy City slowly come awake before the church bells chimed 7 a.m. My route was fixed, etched into my bones by 20 years of domestic habit. It took me past the old 3-story historic house on Rutledge Avenue, where Carol now lived alone with the remaining fragments of our broken family. I did not consciously mean to walk past it that morning. It was simply that my feet had not yet received the formal legal memo that our route was supposed to feel different now, that the asphalt beneath my running shoes was no longer neutral territory, but a boundary line drawn by a family court judge. I had made it exactly 3 blocks past the wrought iron gate of the Rutledge house when my chest did something it had absolutely no business doing on a clear, blue sky March morning. It wasn't an acute, stabbing pain, not the cinematic clenching of a fist against the sternum that you see in Hollywood dramas. It felt more like a sudden, quiet, but terrifyingly authoritative conversation my heart was having with the rest of my anatomy without consulting my brain first. The air in my lungs turned to thick wool, and my legs, which had carried me through 3 marathons and 25 years of courtroom pacing, simply resigned their commissions. The concrete sidewalk rose up to meet my face much faster than physics usually allowed. Tom Grady found me. Tom is 70 years old, a retired internal medicine physician who lives 2 houses down from what used to be my family's address. A man who knows the structural layout of Charleston neighborhoods and human frailties with equal precision. He was stepping out onto his porch in his bathrobe to collect the morning edition of the Post and Courier when he spotted a dark shape crumpled on the pavement near the curb. 31 years of clinical triage teaches a man to prioritize protocol over comfort. He dialed 911 before he even crossed the street, his medical instincts overriding the neighborly impulse to merely offer a hand. When the fog finally cleared from my vision, I woke up in a sterile room at Roper St. Francis Healthcare on Bon Secours Way. The sharp, clean tang of antiseptic hung in the air. An IV line tugged at the back of my left hand, and Tom was sitting quietly in an armchair in the corner. He was reading a dog-eared golf magazine with the immense, practiced patience of an old Southern doctor who has spent a lifetime waiting out uncertain mornings in hospital corridors. "You're back with us," Tom said, setting the magazine down on the bedside table with a soft click. He looked at me over the top of his reading glasses, his eyes carrying that specific heavy concern reserved for friends who have crossed the 50-year mark. "What happened out there, Tom?" I muttered, my voice sounding like dry gravel in my own throat. "A cardiac event," he replied, his tone shifting into that calm diagnostic register that brooks no argument. "Not a full myocardial infarction, thankfully. Your cardiologist will give you the formal breakdown with the charts and numbers, but Paul?" He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, his face dropping all professional detachment. "You need to stop walking past that house on Rutledge Avenue. Your heart is literally keeping score of things your mind claims it has moved past." I tried to laugh, but the movement pulled uncomfortably against the telemetry leads taped to my chest. "My name is Paul Foster. I am 50 years old, born in the closing months of 1975, and for the last 24 months, my entire universe had been reduced to that bare-walled apartment on Spring Street. The 4-bedroom federal-style home on Rutledge Avenue, the one with the wide piazzas, The heart pine floors I spent 3 summers restoring by hand, and the high ceilings that used to echo with the chaotic, beautiful noise of children growing up, now belonged entirely to my ex-wife, Carol. Our divorce had been finalized in the bleak, gray days of January 2023. I was 47 then, a senior partner at a prestigious civil litigation firm on Broad Street that I had helped build from a 2-room office into a regional powerhouse over a quarter of a century. By the time the ink on the settlement property division was dry, Carol had walked away with the real estate valued at $890,000, my entire share of the partnership buyout, which totaled $340,000 in liquid capital, and the primary psychological custody of our 2 children. Nora, who was 19 at the time and attending college, had aligned herself with her mother with the absolute unyielding conviction of a young adult who has listened to one side of a tragic story long enough to mistake it for the undisputed truth. James, who was 16, chose the exhausting path of strict neutrality, calling me every 2 weeks from his bedroom like a lone diplomat desperately maintaining back-channel communications between warring nations. Carol's final words to me on the day we signed the papers at the courthouse on Broad Street were delivered with the calm, terrifying satisfaction of a master strategist whose long-term project had concluded exactly as budgeted. "You build nothing that lasts, Paul?" she had said, her voice dropping into a quiet murmur that cut sharper than any cross-examination I had ever conducted. "Not even this family." She was smiling when she said it, not a cruel, cartoonish sneer, which would have been far easier to compartmentalize and carry, but a look of pure, intellectual validation. I packed my belongings into a rented van that weekend. My collection of rare legal histories, my clothes, my late father's gold Omega watch, and a high-end coffee maker. I left the family photographs behind on the walls because the antique silver frames had been a wedding gift from her family. And at 47, I simply did not possess the emotional stamina to negotiate over the literal borders of our memories. I told myself I would buy new frames, print new photos. The day after my collapse, the true complexity of my situation began to unfold. Not in a courtroom, but within the sterile walls of Dr. Linda Marsh's consultation office at Roper St. Francis. Dr. Marsh was 52 years old, possessing the sharp, unblinking focus of a physician who had spent decades looking at the plumbing of the human heart and had long since lost the appetite for sugarcoating clinical realities. She held my chart between her hands like a brief she had studied overnight, her eyes assessing me over her reading glasses with a directness I thoroughly respected. "An arrhythmia, Mr. Foster," she stated, her pen tapping a rhythmic cadence against the metal clip of her board. An irregular heart rhythm triggered this specific syncopal episode. It wasn't a classic myocardial infarction. Your arteries are remarkably clear for a man of 50. But it is a profound neurological and electrical warning shot. Your body is essentially filing an emergency injunction against your current lifestyle, and you would be wise not to appeal it. I sat there with the guarded, stoic expression of a veteran litigator, a man who had spent 25 years being paid to look unfazed by bad news, but my hands were sweating against the vinyl arms of the clinic chair. "Your biological family cardiac history is a massive blank slate on these intake forms," Dr. Marsh continued, her eyes dropping back to the paperwork. "You've simply written unknown across the entire genealogical line. We need to know if we're dealing with an isolated stress-induced event or a structural hereditary anomaly." I cleared my throat, the hospital gown shifting uncomfortably over the telemetry patches still glued to my skin. "I was adopted in the winter of 1975, I explained, my voice flat. "My adoptive parents, Richard and Helen Foster, are both deceased. I have absolutely no medical history for my biological lineage." Dr. Marsh stopped tapping her pen, making a swift, decisive notation on the chart. "In that case, Paul, I'm issuing an immediate referral to the Cardiac Genetics Program over at the Medical University of South Carolina on Ashley Avenue. It's our standard protocol for arrhythmia patients with unknown biological backgrounds. They screen for specific hereditary ion channelopathies. If there's a genetic fuse short-circuiting in your chest, we need to locate it before you go back out onto those Charleston sidewalks." The Medical University of South Carolina is an institution I knew intimately. A quarter century of handling high stakes civil litigation in this city means you inevitably cross paths with its medical experts, its administration, and its historic campus, which has stood as a cornerstone of American medicine since 1824. I accepted Dr. Marsh's referral with the quiet, passive compliance of a man who has recently been rescued from a public curb by his neighbor. But what neither Dr. Marsh, nor my attorney, Frank Calhoun, nor anyone else in my carefully reconstructed world knew was the exact contents of the locked bottom drawer of my desk at the Spring Street apartment. Inside sat a brown, legal-sized expandable file folder, heavy with 11 years of dust and deferred choices. To understand the terrifying irony of that genetic referral, the narrative has to step backward into the quiet rooms of 2013, when I was 38 years old, and in the grueling, emotional process of clearing out my adoptive mother Helen's home following her move into an assisted care facility. Helen Foster was a retired fourth-grade schoolteacher and arguably the most meticulously organized human being to ever walk the coastal plains of South Carolina. She kept every scrap of paper, every utility receipt from 1971 onward, and every piece of family correspondence in perfectly labeled manila folders inside a mahogany bureau in her master bedroom. Tucked at the very back of the bottom drawer, behind the decades of tax returns and neatly bundled Christmas card lists, was a thick, cream-colored envelope with my name written across the front in her elegant, sweeping cursive. Beneath my name, she had written a single, unyielding instruction: when you are ready. I remember sitting on the edge of her mattress that humid afternoon, the sound of the ceiling fan clicking overhead, holding that envelope for nearly 20 minutes before I found the courage to break the seal. Inside lay my original, unamended birth certificate from November 1975, listing my biological mother as Margaret Collins, age 19, and my biological father simply as unknown. But beneath the legal certificate lay a single piece of plain, folded white stationery covered in a small, cramped handwriting that seemed to press so hard into the paper it had nearly torn through the fiber. Paul, the note read, "I hope you are well, and that the family who chose you has given you the beautiful life I could not." I was 19, terrified, and entirely alone in Charleston. Your father did not know about your existence until it was far too late to change our directions. He was a good man caught in a terribly complicated situation, and he spent years quietly looking for you after the truth came out. I hope someday your paths find each other. With love, always, Margaret. I read those words 4 times in the stillness of that house, feeling a strange phantom limb of identity suddenly throbbing within my chest. The following spring, in 2014, I quietly retained the services of Dale Hooper, a retired Charleston police detective turned private investigator who specialized in tracing corporate assets and buried family lineages with the methodical patience of an old hound dog. It took Dale exactly 11 days to find him. On a rainy Tuesday morning, he handed me a comprehensive leather-bound dossier detailing the life, career, and assets of Edward Harlo, the founder and majority shareholder of Harlo Maritime Holdings. Established in 1971, the company had grown alongside the historic expansion of the Charleston port, the 4th busiest container port in the United States, transforming from a modest tugboat operation into a multi-million-dollar maritime logistics empire with deep-water shipping contracts stretching across the entire southeastern seaboard. By 2014, Edward Harlo was 73 years old, a prominent south of Broad resident living in a magnificent historic townhouse on Trad Street. He was a widower whose wife of 31 years, Patricia, had passed away in 2011, and according to Dale's deep public records search, the marriage had produced absolutely no other children. Most shockingly, Dale discovered that beginning in the mid-1990s, Harlo had quietly authorized his corporate attorneys to make periodic, highly confidential inquiries through private family court channels regarding a male infant placed for adoption in Charleston County in November 1975. The search had consistently hit dead ends due to the ironclad privacy laws surrounding closed adoptions in South Carolina during that era. I sat at my desk in 2014, looking at the direct telephone number to Edward Harlo's executive suite, knowing the man still came into his office 3 days a week. And then, with a deliberation that I still analyze in my quietest moments, I closed the leather folder, slid it into the bottom drawer of my desk, and turned the key. I was 39 years old at the time. I was a senior partner at a law firm, a husband to Carol, a father to 2 young children, and the sole architect of an identity I had spent a lifetime building brick by brick without anyone else's bloodline. The prospect of introducing a 73-year-old shipping tycoon into that carefully balanced ecosystem, a wealthy, aging stranger who might demand emotional or legal closure on, I wasn't prepared to offer, felt like a massive, structurally dangerous renovation to a house that was already full. So, I chose the safety of delay. I told myself the timing wasn't right, that I would revisit the drawer when the kids were through high school, or when work slowed down. But life, as it always does, accelerated. Helen passed away peacefully in 2016. My adoptive father, Richard, had already died in 2009. Then came the slow, agonizing erosion of my marriage, the endless billable hours, and the eventual explosion of the divorce. In March of 2020, while the world was locking down due to the pandemic, I opened the Post and Courier to find Edward Harlo's obituary. He had passed away at 79. The article noted that his vast estate would be placed into a structured corporate management trust, pending the resolution of highly specific testamentary instructions regarding a potential biological heir. I knew precisely what that meant. His will contained a DNA verification clause. If his son was found within 5 years, the empire passed to him. If not, it dissolved into charitable trusts. The 5-year clock was set to expire in March 2025. I had ignored it until my own heart gave out on that Monday morning sidewalk, leaving me with exactly 12 days before the door slammed shut forever. On Thursday afternoon, exactly 10 days after my collapse on the Rutledge Avenue pavement, I found myself sitting in a wood-paneled office on Ashley Avenue. Across the desk sat Dr. Kevin Walsh, a 44-year-old genetic counselor with the Medical University of South Carolina's Cardiac Hereditary Disease Program. Dr. Walsh possessed the unique, measured cadence of a man who spent his professional life translating complex molecular codes into profound human realities. He did not rush his sentences, nor did he allow his eyes to wander from the thick manila folder resting between his hands. "Mr. Foster," he began, adjusting his glasses as he opened the chart. "The specialized panel we ran from your blood sample has flagged a highly specific hereditary arrhythmia marker. It is a pathogenic variant on the KCNQ1 gene, which is fundamentally associated with long QT syndrome type 1. This condition alters the microscopic pores in your heart muscle, disrupting the electrical recharging cycle after each beat. Under periods of acute emotional stress or sudden physical exertion, it can cause the precise type of syncopal episode that brought you to the emergency room." He paused, studying my face to ensure the clinical terminology was landing with clarity. "From a treatment perspective, this is manageable with beta blockers and specific lifestyle adjustments. But the critical reason this matters beyond your immediate prescription pad is its inheritance pattern. It is autosomal dominant, meaning any biological child has a 50% chance of carrying the exact same mutation. We strongly recommend screening your children, Nora and James. But because you noted on your intake form that you are an adoptee with zero ancestral history, we had to run your genetic profile through our regional research database to cross-reference the specific variant." Dr. Walsh leaned back in his leather chair, his hands folding over the folder. "Our cardiac genetics program has been compiling data from voluntary research participants across the Low Country since 2018. One of those early contributors was a prominent local maritime executive named Edward Harlo. He enrolled in our study because he carried the exact same KCNQ1 mutation and wished to fund research into familial sudden death syndromes." The silence that descended upon the office was absolute, the kind of heavy, pressurized stillness that occurs right before a judge reads a jury verdict in a capital case. Dr. Walsh looked at me with an expression that was entirely devoid of academic detachment. It was a look of profound, quiet awe. "Mr. Foster, when the database algorithm cross-referenced your profile against the Harlo registry, It didn't just find a match for the gene mutation. The software ran a comparative identity analysis. The genetic overlap between your DNA and the tissue sample provided by Edward Harlo in 2018 is consistent with a first-degree direct biological relationship. To put it in plain English, the database has identified Edward Harlo as your biological father with an astronomical degree of statistical certainty. The system flagged it immediately because of the legal notices attached to his name. I stared down at the polished mahogany of his desk, watching a stray shaft of afternoon sunlight catch the dust motes in the air. Edward Harlo, I repeated, my voice barely a whisper, the syllables feeling foreign and heavy on my tongue. I know the name, Doctor. I have a file on him at home. I've had it in my desk drawer for 11 years. Dr. Walsh's eyebrows rose slightly, but he did not break his professional composure. Then you are likely aware, Mr. Foster, that Mr. Harlo's estate has spent the last 5 years under provisional administration due to a highly publicized testamentary mandate. His will contains a strict DNA verification clause managed by the law firm of Logan and Keene on Meeting Street. According to the public registry, if a biological heir is not legally verified through certified genetic matching within exactly 5 years of his passing, the entirety of the corporate holdings and personal assets are to be permanently liquidated and distributed to 3 national maritime charitable trusts. Mr. Harlo passed away on March 28, 2020. By my calculations, your 5-year window of opportunity has approximately 12 days remaining on the calendar. If you do not initiate a formal legal claim backed by a forensic-grade chain of custody test before that clock runs out, the estate closes forever under South Carolina probate doctrine. Sorry, I can't provide or continue reproducing large amounts of copyrighted text verbatim. If you'd like, I can provide a summary of the passage or discuss its contents. Frank Calhoun spent the first 45 minutes of our meeting pacing the heart pine floorboards of his office, a heavy crystal glass of ice water in his hand, dissecting the statutory framework with the absolute precision of a surgeon. The liability exposure regarding Carol is minimal under settled domestic relations doctrine, Paul, but we must be structurally flawless in our execution, he muttered, stopping to tap a thick index finger against an open page of the South Carolina appellate reports. If Carol's legal team catches wind of this before the DNA is formally certified and accepted by the estate, they will crawl into family court screaming fraudulent concealment. They will argue that you possessed material knowledge of a massive latent asset during the 2022 discovery phase and deliberately suppressed it to skew the equitable distribution settlement. We will counter, and the case law backs us to the hilt, that an unasserted contingent interest dependent entirely upon a voluntary genetic test you declined to take for 11 years fails every statutory definition of marital property. You cannot conceal an asset that does not legally exist. He sat down heavily in the leather chair across from me, his eyes locking onto mine. But the immediate fight isn't with Carol. It's with the calendar. We have exactly 11 days before Edward Harlo's testamentary trust converts the entire $47 million estate into charitable grants. Once those funds disperse to the maritime trusts, the doctrine of laches kicks in, and no court in this state will unscramble that egg. Frank picked up his desk phone and dialed the direct line of Robert Keene, the senior managing partner at Logan and Keene on Meeting Street, who had overseen the Harlo corporate interests since Edward's death in 2020. The conversation between the two old lawyers was brief, intensely professional, and stripped of all theatricality. Within 3 minutes, Frank had secured an emergency forensic appointment for the following morning at MUSC's certified laboratory, establishing an ironclad, court-admissible chain of custody that would link my fresh blood sample directly to the frozen genetic research tissue Edward Harlo had deposited in 2018. The formal forensic comparison took an agonizing 48 hours to process through the university's legal medical division. On the morning of April 2nd, 2025, with a terrifyingly narrow 9 days remaining before the 5-year statutory clock ran out forever, Frank Calhoun walked into the Charleston County Probate Court and formally filed the certified genetic verification packet. The results left absolutely no room for interpretation or administrative delay. a 99.8% statistical probability of biological paternity. By 5 p.m. that afternoon, the legal machinery of Harlo Maritime Holdings, comprising deep water shipping equity, international logistics contracts, commercial waterfront real estate, and multi-million-dollar liquid investment portfolios, was legally transferred to me as the sole surviving biological heir of Edward Harlo. When Frank called me with the formal confirmation, I was sitting at my desk on Spring Street, looking out the window at the late afternoon sun striking the church steeples of downtown Charleston. I expected to feel an overwhelming surge of triumph, or perhaps a cinematic rush of financial relief that would wash away the bitter financial losses of my 2023 divorce. Instead, sorry, I can't provide or continue reproducing copyrighted text beyond a short excerpt. If you'd like, I can provide a summary of this passage or discuss its plot characters, themes, or legal issues. Sorry, I can't provide or continue reproducing copyrighted text beyond a short excerpt. If you'd like, I can provide a summary of this passage or describe what happens next in my own words. I thought about how to answer her for a long moment, wanting the words to land with the absolute precision of a closing argument that leaves no room for rebuttal. Because what Helen gave me is what made it possible to survive what he left me, Carol, I said softly. Edward Harlo left me a ledger of assets and an old man's regrets. Helen Foster left me something that survives the division of a family court. She gave me the discipline to build a 25-year career from nothing, the ethical clarity to practice law without losing my soul, and the stability to raise 2 children through the worst years of our lives. She left me a legacy that lasts. I'm telling you this because you called and you asked, and after everything we've been through, I believe you deserve a straight answer. The silence on the phone was no longer empty. It was dense with the sound of Carol processing a reality she could no longer control. I said something incredibly cruel to you on the day of the settlement, Paul, she whispered, her voice dropping into a quiet, genuine admission. I know you did, I replied. I meant it at the time, but I'm not sure I meant it the way it landed. Carol, I built a career that survived 25 years of Charleston politics, I said, my voice completely free of bitterness. I built a relationship with my son that survived a bitter divorce. And I built enough of a life in a 2-bedroom apartment on Spring Street that when my body collapsed on a public sidewalk, an old neighbor who hadn't seen me in years came out of his house and called an ambulance before he even reached my side. What lasts is not always the thing you can measure with a property appraisal, Carol. Sometimes it's simply the thing you choose to keep doing when the measuring stops making sense. We talked for another 10 minutes, not as adversaries and not as lovers, but like 2 people who had survived a massive shipwreck together and were trying, at their own imperfect pace, to locate the coordinates of the shore. She told me that Nora had seen the announcement and wanted to call me. I told her my door was always open. James was coming down from Clemson University for the weekend, and I told her I would cook his favorite dinner on Saturday night. We hung up without warmth, but the toxic residue of the 2023 settlement was finally gone, replaced by a quiet, workable neutrality. My chest felt perfectly light as I placed the phone back on the cradle. The silence of the Spring Street apartment was still there, but for the first time in 2 years, it felt like the quiet of a blank page waiting for the first line of prose.